I think in addition to many other things that you may have noticed, there are clearly some core disagreements here as to what the good life looks like. What is the Torah work balance, if you will, that a person is supposed to have? And the Rambam, the first text on this page, as opposed to the Kesef Mishnah and the Yam Shel Shlomo at the second half of the page, really say two fundamentally different things on that point. And I want to make sure we underscore those before we move on to the ways in which we can potentially reconcile them. The Rambam's language here is really almost over the top. The language of someone who supports themselves not through work, but by getting some kind of handout for Torah, that person is Harei ze chilel et Hashem uvaza et haTorah. Person has desecrated God's name, and this I think is the key point, has actually shown contempt for Torah itself. The Rambam is not willing to look at Torah like that as having a value, being a good thing, but you shouldn't have gotten support in order to do it. It actually undermines what Torah is. That is to say, the essence of Torah for the Rambam is something that by definition accompanies and informs work. And the second it is severed from that pursuit of work, it actually ceases to be Torah. That's a very important point to understand here. Because the Kesef Mishnah and the Yam Shel Shlomo, for all their protestations that all they're concerned about is that Torah somehow make it to the next generation, which we'll talk about in a minute, clearly are able to say that full-time scholars are able to transmit Torah to the next generation because they think full-time scholars are capable of producing Torah. And I want you to understand that the Rambam is really effectively saying that a full-time scholar cannot produce Torah. Whatever it is that that person is doing in the Beit Midrash, whatever it is that's happening when they memorize millions of Mishnayot, have all kinds of insights to the biblical text that they're learning, it's somehow a perversion of Torah, a kind of bizarro image of Torah, as opposed to what Torah itself is supposed to be. And that distinction, I think, is very important to understand. Now, with that in hand, I imagine there are ways you thought that these texts could actually be reconciled. Let's just get one thought on that. For those of you who saw these texts and are the kinds of learners who like to say, no, there's no disagreement here. Actually, everything can be patched up nicely. How can these play together? How can these texts coexist? Please. Good, so we'll get to 8 in a minute, which is definitely a highly synthetic text. One other thought on this piece, Adam.
Coming at it from
Oh, sorry, we'll come back, we'll summarize it all together, yeah.
Coming at it from the perspective of someone who is currently on an academic job market, can you understand it as teaching is somehow a form of work that is separate from learning? In other words, then if you want to learn, you have to teach, and the teaching is what's paying your salary, and the learning is, so maybe that's a way of reconciling.
Okay, so there may be ways of, both ways of sort of characterizing the substance of what the learning actually is that may somehow synthesize a full-time learner with the concerns laid out with the Rambam. And then also the question of maybe there are kind of subcomponents to the experience of learning. Maybe there's such a thing as applied learning. We'll get to in a second with the Dvar Shmuel there at the end that somehow can bridge that gap. I would suggest to you here also that it's important to keep in mind when you think about these texts synthetically that the Rambam on the one hand and the Kesef Mishnah and the Yam Shel Shlomo on the other hand are actually answering two very different kinds of questions. The Rambam, if you really look at him closely, is really answering questions about virtue and the nature of the kind of Torah that integrates with life. He is asking a question fundamentally about the individual and how the person who learns will be affected by being a full-time student. And the fear, therefore, says the Rambam, is that person will cease to learn how to translate what they are learning into life and will end up in this very strong phrase, Sof Adam zeh sheyeheh melastem et habriot. The person at the end of the day will come to steal from other people. Because the person, in terms of cultivating their own virtue as a learner, will not have experientially conditioned themselves to treat their Torah as something that translates into the rest of life. That frame of virtue, what's the kind of Torah that one should be learning, is very, very different from the question that the Kesef Mishneh and the Yam Shel Shlomo are really asking, which is, what does it take as a community to secure Torah for the next generation? I can have all of my theories about what the ideal Torah is for an individual to learn, what the weekly schedule should look like in terms of when I go to my job, when I go to my gym, when I have a chavruta, etc. And it could be, say the Kesef Mishneh and the Yam Shel Shlomo, that will actually add up collectively to catastrophe. What works for the individual may not be sustainable for the community. And in that sense, I think the Yam Shel Shlomo here has a wonderful line that those of us who have come to know the Rambam over the years often feel, where he basically says, most people can't really be like the Rambam. It's all well and good to say, yes, work 8 hours a day, eat and take care of your other needs 8 hours a day, and study 8 hours a day. I guess not sleep. I guess have someone else deal with your kids. Still looking for that solution, haven't found it yet. But there's a notion that the Yam Shel Shlomo is playing out here that it's actually not so clear that the Rambam's model is communally sustainable. You know, I'm reminded when you read the Rambam's theory of work-Torah balance, you're reminded of Marx's line where he talks about in the ideal society, every man would be a hunter by day, a fisherman in the afternoon, and a critic by night. And while there sounds nothing better than that for the kind of life that an individual would lead, we also all know that the way societies organize themselves and have division of labor and apportion the tasks that the community as a whole relies on can't really work with that model. And in that sense, there has to be a way, I would say based on that difference alone, for these texts to somehow work together. Now the Dvar Shmuel, which some of you saw, source number 8, perhaps some of you even hacked through the clipped from Hebrew books Rashi text there on page 4. Hats off to you if you did. Really tries, I think, in fact, to do this. Right? He is asked point blank. It's sort of an amazing question. You know, usually you get all kinds of responsa literature. What do I do if I forgot to say such and such in my davening? Or what if this fell into my pot and I have to know if I need to kosher it? And here you have this question. What's the best way to live my life? How am I supposed to divide up my time? Should I just engage with Torah all week? Or should I work and then, resign myself to learning only on Shabbat? Working all week and hanging out on Shabbat and playing board games, not an option, okay? And he says here, I think, some of you read it, but I think it's important to read it aloud here. He says, it seems to me that even Rambam would agree in the present case